introduction of the production-linked incentive scheme, together with enhanced technology support led by the adoption of Open RAN and investments in 5G telephony, is expected to bring in a course reversal for Indian telecom companies, which have been largely import dependent and reliant on global vendors for their network rollouts. In the upcoming panel discussion, we'll hear from industry experts sharing their viewpoint on production-linked incentive and Open RAN, making domestic manufacturing healthier. I would like to invite Mahesh Uppal, founder, ComFirst India Private Limited, to moderate this panel discussion. Over to you, Mr. Uppal.
Well, welcome to this very important session of ET Telecom, which is related to production-linked incentives and Open RAN, making domestic manufacturing healthier. This, as we all know, is an extremely important subject and a subject of currently very, very high levels of agreements as well as concerns. We all know that digital technologies and networks will be at the center of India's future growth. India, therefore, has a legitimate interest in being not just a market, but also a player in this ecosystem. The current high level of dependence on imports is therefore a major concern. As we all know, it is unsustainable in the long run, unless, of course, India can be more of a player than simply an importer of equipment. Our share of local value add, therefore, needs to go up and fast. The question is, can we source more equipment locally? Can we also increase virtualization of network functions and thus reduce our dependence on hardware, which is a far more problematic area for us? So we see, therefore, that the government's ambitious program of Atmanirbharta has these dual aspects. One, about the focus on domestic manufacturing, as well as a focus also, and being in line with industry's interest in Open RAN solutions. You can see that both these are two sides of the same coin. Today, we have a very eminent set of speakers in our panel. Let me just list them for you in the beginning. We have Mr. Raghunandan, who is the new Secretary of TRAI, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. We have General Kochhar, who is the Director General of the Cellular Operators Association of India. Mr. T.R. Dua, who is the Director General of the Telecom and Infrastructure Providers Association. We have Mr. Manish Gange, who is the Head of R&D at Bharti Airtel. And Mr. P. Balaji, who is the Chief Regulatory and Corporate Affairs Officer at Vodafone Idea. And last but not the least, Mr. Vinod Joseph, who is the Technical Leader of APJ in China at VMware. Now, as you can guess, these are people who are eminently qualified to speak about the issues that we are discussing today. And I'm going to start with the TRAI to provide us a broad overview of the issues surrounding PLI and Open RAN from a regulatory perspective. We'll follow this with the presentation from Mr. Kochhar to give us a mobile industry perspective. Mr. Dua will share the perspective of infrastructure players. We'll then move on to individual telcos, Mr. Balaji and Mr. Gange from Vodafone Idea and Airtel respectively will give us the individual operators' perspective. And last but not the least, we will move to Mr. Joseph, who will then tell us or who will discuss the issue from the vendor's perspective. So without losing any more time, may I now request the TRAI Secretary, Mr. Raghunandan, to make his opening remarks in about 5-6 minutes, tell us from his perspective how urgent domestic manufacturing, domestic telecom manufacturing is. What is the TRAI's approach to this? Will all this impact India's 5G plans? Over to you, Mr. Raghunandan.
First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. And also, I am very thankful for being in the panel of distinguished guests whom you have mentioned just now. As far as the views and then the broad perspective of TRAI as a regulator in the telecom sector is concerned, I just wanted to say something about your domestic manufacturing. You were talking about what you have said me about the holistic perspective. What in TRAI, in the regulatory perspective, we always look at is, first of all, you asked me one question that how urgent is the need for the domestic telecom manufacturing. So now coming to that question, you know very well that our NDCP has set an ambitious target of universal broadband for all by 2022. So it is, we are yet to meet, we are far away from that target. Even though it is ambitious, we need to meet the target. And then, as you know, that despite the, I must appreciate the major efforts made by the domestic industry to come up and then contribute for the telecom equipment side, telecom sector as a whole. But barring certain device-related manufacturing, it is yet to pick up actually the domestic manufacturing in the whole sector. So certainly our recommendations also, if you see that, we felt that there is a need for the domestic manufacturing share to be increased so that the small players, medium players and big players all will coexist. Our TRAI's always approach has been that you allow the more players to be in the whole sector, be it small, medium or bigger. That is our approach. And the another approach which you are telling me about the TRAI's regulatory perspective, we have always maintained a technology neutral and technology agnostic approach. So we have never told that whether it is a particular technology has to be adopted or anything. So we have just left open to the industry, whichever actually the TEC and then our national or international standards, whichever the equipment has been prescribed, you can always use those equipment. So that has been our perspective. And coming back to your another point which you have mentioned is that whether how it will actually is going to impact our 5G plans, etc. Certainly, because the Open RAN which you have mentioned, as the technology, if you see the 5G itself, it encourages the disaggregation, whether it is in the core part, whether it is in the RAN part, anywhere. Disaggregation is the main, and you have also mentioned in your opening remarks about the network function virtualization. So it's all virtualization means India's core strength, where virtualization means it is mainly software driven and India's core strength. Even a small, medium players can play, and the bigger players always they can play an integration role. They have their own core strengths and then give the pie to the medium players and then the small players. So in that way, I think all have to play a role, and leveraging India's strengths in the software, especially in the software segment. And then this is what actually in brief about my thoughts about that. And as far as our earlier recommendations are concerned, we have given a very clear recommendations in 2018 itself. Our domestic manufacturing should cover including design and then development and the whole perspective holistically. This is what in essence I wanted to say about. Thank you. I think I wanted to more listen from the other speakers than giving my perspective. We have already given our recommendations. I look forward closely for your discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Raghunandan, for very insightful remarks, as well as sticking to the time schedule. I'm very grateful. I move on now to General Kochhar, who will give us the Telecom Industry Association perspective. The question that I had suggested to him was, how can telcos as a group support domestic manufacturing, and what kind of challenges do they face when they attempt to move towards locally manufactured equipment? So over to you, General Kochhar.
Thank you, Mr. Uppal. Now, telecom industry is faced with a dichotomous situation, actually. They are definitely unequivocally supporting Make in India, certainly. But they have also got to see that the revenues part is not lost sight of. At this point of time, as you know, telecom industry is bleeding, and therefore all their efforts have to go in the direction of saving revenues wherever possible. And the third thing is they are committed to taking the best telecom service to the worst placed citizen of India. So this is a crucible in which they work. And in this overarching picture that has been painted, I would like to say that Open RAN is something that meets the bill squarely for telcos, in the sense it saves them revenues and gives them flexibility. It meets the requirements of the government of Make in India, and taking 5G to the masses in a faster time frame, and also encouraging PMI. Although PMI you are not listed as part of the subject, but PMI is equally relevant to the discussion. The third are the subscribers, and they are the most important. They will get differentiated services. The very fact that Open RAN disaggregates the control plane and the data plane makes it possible with other features of 5G to give a differential type of treatment to different segments of people at a low cost. Now, technologically and operationally, Open RAN meets the requirements very well, because if we are going to encourage manufacturing in India, it cannot overnight start competing with the biggies of the world. And therefore, if they have to make equipment which is hardware based and which is company based, that may not be possible in the immediate future. Hence, aggregating disparate equipment which meets the requirements set forth by the regulator, by the government of India, into a holistic whole is what Open RAN will do. But this is the advantage. Second thing is that we have a huge network of 4G. And the 5G which is going to come into the country is going to be a non-standalone 5G initially. Now, if we have to use the resources of existing 4G networks, we have to then aggregate whatever, we have to amalgamate whatever is existing in 4G and provide a 5G network. To do that, there are only two methods of doing it. One is you have a separate sliced frequency band from your existing holding and make it exclusive of 5G, which is a costly affair. The second is put Open RAN, use Open RAN and aggregate the components which are already there, and you will be able to give 5G services at a lower cost. So revenues will be saved, the time for deployment will be less, your reach of 5G will suddenly increase. Now, if I translate this into the PLI scheme, that is a very good scheme which has come about. Of course, the schemes will have to be refined. But within what is existing today, encouragement which is being provided to the MSMEs to build components, systems, subsystems, and then aggregated using things like Open RAN is something which will make our march towards domestic manufacturing in 5G faster. And that is something which Mr. Raghunandan also alluded to, and I heartily agree with that. Well, obviously, the PLI scheme, we as an association have been urging the government that there will be multiple dividends if you club PLI with PMI, right? Because PMI is not a separate scheme, PLI is a separate scheme, but if you combine the two of them, the benefits will be immense, right? The manufacturing in India will now see the light of day because, as Mr. Raghunandan said, we are good in software. Although I have a little bit to say on that the software we are good in is application software, not network software. So therefore, the capacity to become equally good in that will have to be built along with industry and academia, and that effort should start now. Instead of no, we are faced with the situation where either we become assemblers in India, get hardware from outside, and assemble components in India, say we are manufacturing in India, or we use devices, the technologies like Open RAN, and actually make a system of subsystems, which is actual manufacturing in India. So that is something which needs to be encouraged, and therefore PLI and PMI need to be clubbed together to give the benefit to people. We have to build up a testing ecosystem, because any component which is built, whether in India or abroad, has to go through the testing process. Do we have that sufficiency yet? No, we don't. So therefore, that has to be built in. The standards have to be enforced. That should be part of the scheme. So I think these are the things I would like to say in the beginning itself.
Thank you, General Kochhar. Thank you for your help with the time. And maybe I can now move on to Mr. Dua, who actually will provide us an equally important perspective, which, and also from an area where we have done rather well in the past, and that is the whole business of infrastructure provision, and particularly the whole area of infrastructure sharing. So my question to Mr. Dua was whether the PLI as well as Open RAN is an opportunity for infrastructure providers, and whether there are concerns they have to improve it, which concerns they have with respect to the scheme, and whether something can be done to improve it. Mr. Dua.
Thanks, Mahesh, for giving a very comprehensive brief right in the beginning. And thanks to Secretary TR and Kochhar. I think I'll divide this discussion into 3 parts. 1, what is the scheme about? Second is, where are we placed as the infrastructure provider? And how do we really make use of this Open RAN system into our registration scheme? First of all, thanks to ET for organizing such an initiative. It's a great initiative. I think the government has taken a bold step, which is a transformative. It will boost the economy. Besides that, it will create millions of jobs for the people, and also reduce dependence on the imports. Rather, it will increase the export. Not only that, it clearly shows the commitment of and it is an evidence of the commitment of the government having put 15,000 crore rupees. This will attract investments into the chain. Now, as far as the IPs are concerned, we do get benefit out of this, maybe direct or indirect. We have a number of vendors who are providing the accessories. Now, with this initiative of the PLI available to a lot of small guys who are manufacturing these accessories, it will create a very competitive supply chain for the infrastructure provider, which today, sometimes we have to only depend on one single or two. Now, coming back to the Open RAN, as you know, traditionally, all the telcos and the IPs, they have been dependent on the hardware-driven approach, which means, you know, if you want to add a layer, you could add the layer, but it was again became a little tough when you want to upgrade the network, or you need to change, or you put the new technologies into it, and you became a vendor dependent on this. That was another issue. So therefore, there was also a bit of financials which were involved by the user, and there was a bit of, you know, lack of initiative on the part. Now, if you talk of the Open RAN, to realize all these, you know, dependency on the vendor, dependence on the financial, and there was a less scope of adopting new innovative methodology to do this. The Open RAN came as a preferred technology, which means the hardware and the hardware, they were decoupled into this, which helps, and it is going to help in helping the faster rollout of the network, and also flexibility for the deployment. And if you want to upgrade the network, number one, it was easy. Sometimes it was difficult to replace the network. Now, easier to replace the network nodes And whenever you find some network or some network element was found not working or not unsatisfactory, now this also tides over that situation. Now, there are two parts. One is the hardware part and the software part. The telcos take care of the software, and as well, the hardware is kind of like RAN or BTS, etc. If you look at, there are certain models which the IP ones have been following. If you look at the traditionally, if you go back about 10 years back, sharing model came, but which was a little bit, there was hesitation on the part of the telcos because of the competitiveness between the two of them. This model has taken off very well, and it has now become a hallmark for the global to emulate this model. Now, this model also envisages sharing of the RAN, sharing of the antenna. But if you look at my registration today, which has a little number of hiccups onto that. Even if you look at the current registration, which does allow me to put owning of the infrastructure like RAN, antenna, BTS, fader. But if you look at the NDCP, which also envisages the deployment of the common shareable passive as well as the infrastructure. Now we look, if I take you back for the last 3 to 4 years time, where every time, and you're well versed with that, every time the TRA has been given recommendation, this is the last recommendation which came to enhance the scope of the IP1s to 13th March 2020. Unfortunately, beside following up with various authorities, this is still not possible and is not. I believe now the TRA recommendations are under implementation. There's an internal network, internal committee has been formed, which will probably look at this. There are certain advantages as an infrastructure. We do provide a neutral host, the best suitable, and it is approved the test of the time to do that. Hopefully, one day, this will also help us to make use of the open RAN, only the hardware part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dua. Thank you very much. And I can now move to Mr. Manish Gange, who actually is at the receiving end of a lot of these things. And clearly, there are both opportunities that the telcos clearly see, as was pointed out also by General Kocher in terms of the cost savings, etc., and also the challenges of incorporating infrastructure, incorporating equipment which they may be less familiar with or may pose other challenges. So maybe I can request you, Mr. Gange, to share a more specific telco, but in fact, your own company's perspective on this, where it sees as the opportunities and where it sees the challenges. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Mr. Opal. So first of all, the two key aspects that we're talking about, one is the PLI and the second is the Open RAN. Without any doubt, PLI is a great scheme. Domestically, I've been following the manufacturing in India for the last 20 years. And there was always a handicap, if you were to say, for the Indian manufacturers to the extent of 10 to 12% to begin with. Now, over the period of last 10 years, the changes into the duty structures and customs, there is a certain handicap that was remaining for the manufacturing, which government has now set right with the help of this incentive of PLI of 46%. So if really look at it, we are now on par with the rest of the world when it comes to generating the efficient manufacturing ecosystem. Anybody who wants to manufacture in India probably will be able to do it at the same cost at anywhere else in the world. So that's a good thing that has already happened. The aspect of Open RAN I'll touch about a little bit later, because this is a very complex subject in terms of how it needs to be tackled. But a little bit more on from the manufacturing perspective, my view is, we are not done with as far as, making sure this ecosystem thrives in India. There is a little bit more work that we need to do to make India really a powerhouse for manufacturing, which is to really go backwards and see what do we have in terms of, are we creating enough designs to be able to manufacture in India? Are we creating enough innovations in India to be able to, bring it into the end users from the end users perspective? And are we building up the right policy framework and the infrastructure element to ensure that the component ecosystem and the semiconductor ecosystem is being developed to support this ultimate, manufacturing setup? That will basically have to be looked at holistically. So there is to be framework. For example, if you really want to develop, the companies in India, the Open RAN offers you the opportunity. Once you open up the systems, standard interfaces, disaggregate the components, there are smaller companies which can get into this and innovate. But there are still handicaps that remain. For example, Jim Kocher also touched upon it. Where are the capability to test what you're building? All right. All the telecom equipment that needs to be built needs to be tested into the real life environment before it really gets deployed, because the lives of subscribers depend on the telecom network. So there is very little ability one has to be able to deploy a system which is not mature. But it's a chicken and egg situation. The smaller companies do not have enough capability to be able to test them. These labs which test them are really expensive because the test equipment that goes in there cost millions of dollars. You need test beds, real test beds with the frequencies available to be able to really test the equipment. So we really have to create that environment. The second thing that really we need to look at, from the supplier ecosystem perspective is to see that the technology access is available to them, which otherwise prevents. For example, if really somebody wants to create a mobile phone today, there is a significant amount of access fee one has to pay to be able to start to design. Now, how do you basically tackle that? Because if you want startups to come and start to play in this market, they need access to that. And I must say that unfortunately, the venture capital in India is really not adequate, adequately supporting that infrastructure players who really want to build the products in that space. So I think there is something that government has to do a little bit more to be able to ensure that they have the access to the risk capital, they have ability to test their, the products that they build. And on the operator side, right, we are really going to be open to bring in everything that gets developed and make sure that we can give them a provenness. Because the two-way the Indian industry will grow. One is there is a domestic consumption that we can enable. And the second thing that we can do is to allow them to export. The export will really happen if there is a provenness available with all the product innovators that we have in India. Now I'll come and address the Open RAN aspect of this, is that there's a great opportunity once you open up the system, once we virtualize the RAN components. What we are doing, when you virtualize the RAN components, there is a software layer that you're creating, and there is a generic hardware layer. This is not the hardware layer that requires specialized ASICs to be built. So semiconductor will be a little bit far away, but you have the ecosystem available of the components. You can build processor-based systems and deploy them. We have the ability to design the servers, the PCs, the laptops, and we can very well upgrade it to make sure that we are building the hardware that goes into building this the underlying infrastructure on which the virtualized layer runs. So that's one aspect of the hardware that Indian ecosystem has to really adopt. The second thing is on the radio side. This is one ecosystem that really is crying for a lot more innovation, a lot more participation from all the players outside of a specific set of countries which are serving that market. And that is something that we need to start to build again. And this radio ecosystem will really get consumed all over the world. You just need to build it the right way and tune in the frequency. And then when you will talk about that, you will talk about backward integration. So for example, some of the key components like filters and all that goes into the radios, they have to be start to build in India because there are very specialized capabilities which India has. And we need to basically build on that. So that's the kind of Open RAN that will allow. The third thing that Open RAN is doing is that softwareization of the entire functionality. in the form of what we call the RIC. And it allows you to build applications which are very innovative, based on AI ML, based on very smart software engineering techniques, which people can now build, put them together, test, and then start to deploy. So from operator perspective, we're in a very great situation with this combination of these the two policies and the technologies are coming together.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And this brings me to Mr. Balaji, who is also a veteran of the sector and who is also in a company which is in unusual circumstances. So perhaps, Balaji, you can actually share the VI perspective, if I may say so, on the whole issue of both PLI as well as Open RAN. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahesh Bhai, and thank you to ET for organizing this very important conference, starting from Mr. Raghunathan to Mr. Kochhar and Mr. Dua and Manish. I think we've covered a lot of ground already, and a very good perspective has been shared on multiple dimensions. I think we all agree on one factor, and I've been around for about 28 years in the sector across all the elements of equipment, devices, and operator space, that this is the time that India has the opportunity to actually take off. If you look at it, the disability factors that Manish touched upon have been addressed significantly. The interest in India and the digital future has been already set by the rather clear $1 trillion economy clarion call that the government has given. And not only are they talking about large vision, but they're also saying, I'll facilitate the whole thing by having enabling policies and also start to allow for implementation to take place. So think about it. I think back in 2000, I've been fortunate to at least work in 3 companies that have had facilities that have been manufacturing that we set up in Bangalore, one hub, Jaipur, and then Pune, and also in Sri Perumbudur. And the quality of the products that were coming from these factories were world class, number one. Number two, the costs at which they could be manufactured was the best in class across countries. And therefore, the talent was already available. So what happened between 2014 and 2020 for mobile space, where the number of factories that have come in, global OEMs and the entire development has taken place, is just the opportunity that we, at least I see, in the space along with my company, Vodafone Idea, in the Open RAN space. So we are preparing for that future, virtualization in a very, very, very major way on the core, and creating future foot elements for deploying 5G technology has been done. That's number one. Number two, trials on various innovations in the Open RAN space is something that we are doing. We're also reaching out to one of our parent companies, the Vodafone Group, that's doing a lot of trials in multiple parts of the country in geographies very similar to India, if I may say, of the Open RAN. We're also engaged closely with the government, who are very open to kind of make sure that the right policy framework and engagement is done to have that deployed in big numbers. It also plays into the sweet spot of the innovation engine that's set up with the Startup India ecosystem that's got built up. From earlier, the focus on consumers, the focus on technology and investing in technology companies by venture capital, angel investors, and also by PEs is starting to take shape. And now you've got unicorns in the core technology space that was never seen before. To me, that's again the right kind of step that's taking place. All we've got to do is to facilitate that by providing what we can bring on the table with the support of enabling policies of the government. Can we provide the kind of test facilities and scaling up possibilities that startups have in this space? Can we provide the space for system integrators that are able to then bring some of these innovative sub-components together to be able to start to provide alternatives to traditional network architectures? And the most important thing is, can we make sure that all of this is done on standards that are global? Because in the end, India is part of a global telecom ecosystem. And if you want to basically succeed, you've got to allow for global scale to be available to innovators in India or anywhere else in the world. So I would just say great space for us to be. The disability factors have been significantly reduced. Innovation engine is there. Capital is willing to flow into technology companies, wasn't the case 5-6 years ago. And we as an operator community and as a specific operator are extremely keen to continue to be providing the right kind of framework and should I say test bed for these innovators to come in. Of course, ensuring that the end consumer, which something General Kochhar said, the least privileged citizen in the country needs to get the best world-class service possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balaji. That is extremely valuable, what you said. I think now we move to Mr. Vinod Joseph from VMware, and hear a perspective that we desperately want to hear and usually do not in telecom meetings in particular, which is the vendor's perspective, particularly vendors such as his. Now, Mr. Joseph, the question really is, do VMware and its peers, and I'm sure there are several dozens of those, see this as an opportunity, and what kind of an opportunity do they see it? Does it have, should the focus, as I mentioned, be on local players or local manufacturing? Can PLIs have an impact on competition between vendors? Those are the kind of questions that I was hoping you would address in your in a very limited time, as you know, we've given you. So I know it's a challenge, but thank you. Over to you.
No, thank you, Mr. Mahesh. Thank you, Dr. Kochhar and Mr. Secretary. It's a pleasure to be here and to share our views. I think we completely appreciate what the Government of India is doing. Absolutely, it is needed and in time. And I think the way we look at it is that India is a huge market, and anybody who wants to leverage that market has to make some sort of a commitment, and that applies to vendors like us. And I think it works both ways, so we completely welcome that. And from VMware's standpoint, just to give you a little bit of background, we are not a hardware company. Neither do we manufacture, any routers or switches or radios. We essentially are a software company that builds telco-grade platforms to actually run much of the software that is needed for the radio and the 5G core infrastructure on a common platform. And I think, like Manish had mentioned earlier, I think the way we look at this industry is disaggregation is the norm. We look at O-RAN actually centering the entire conversation around not just disaggregation, but opening up all of the interfaces, providing much more of a facility for deploying both open source software and open standards, and at the same token, driving innovation at the application layer. And I think if I'm just to add just a couple of few things to the PLI initiatives that the Government of India is talking about, I think it is also important to incentivize not just the hardware vendors or the networking vendors, but also the systems integrators and the application developers. I think that is a very important thing, because if you look at the role of a systems integrator in anything around O-RAN or disaggregation of the networking stack, I think that is a huge opportunity. And today, working with the different countries and different telcos across the world, one challenge we see with enduring the complexity, but of course the great opportunities that O-RAN or anything around disaggregation brings to the table, is who is going to put this together as an ecosystem and make it work production worthy for an operator, right? I mean, that is the big question, because we don't expect the operator, we don't expect Manish or Balaji to actually take up that complexity of deploying O-RAN and making sure it works, because that's where the SI comes in. That's where you require application developers, and there is no dearth for that kind of talent in India. I mean, because we are the software center of the world, if you may, and I think it becomes practically important to incentivize them to start building and evolving this ecosystem around 5G. So I think that would be another key critical ask. The second part is the environment that you build. You need to have certain principles and processes and automation in place. I think that's very important, because given the opportunities with O-RAN, And given that today many countries around the world are talking about using ORAN as a pivot to actually deploy certain industry-specific applications and use cases. For instance, how do I use ORAN for Industry 4.0? How do I use it to better healthcare facilities and anything around telemedicine? How do I actually use it as a vehicle for industrial automation, right? So these applications, and I think Manish very eloquently pointed that out, that these applications that are driven by AI and ML capabilities that actually make these deployments, disaggregated network deployments, a practical use case, a monetizable application is something that we need to leverage an ecosystem and talent that India has. So I think I would look at, I would probably look at those areas to be looked at as well. But I think this is a great start. We as a company, constantly work with our partners here to try and ensure that all of the applications that are going to be deployed on our platform have these open and standard interfaces. That's not an easy battle. This is constantly, you're actually eating into somebody else's pie because most of these deployments have been completely monetized. But what we tend to see in some regions, and I think this should be very important for the Indian market as well, is that any upcoming RFIs or RFEs that come out should insist that these vendors comply to these interfaces. They have to support open standards and open interfaces. They need to ensure that this could be put into production with the right tools and processes around automation. There should be some incentive for them to work with the local SIs, because I think the local SIs do understand the lay of the land. And I think when all of this comes into the fore, you would see the deployments becoming much more faster. And personally, given that I work with other regions as well, in Europe and the American markets as well, I've also seen that there has been a lot of initiative by countries like the UK, as an example, to build these ORAN labs and actually incentivize vendors to come and collaborate there. But I think if I compare what I've seen there to what's happening in India in particular, I think India is far ahead in terms of its assessment, in terms of identifying the use cases for ORAN. And in fact, actually, I would see that the more ORAN deployments would be seen in India ahead of other countries or other geographies. So I think that's my view. I think it should be about incentivizing and creating that ecosystem, and also ensuring that all vendors are aligned to the vision that India has put forward.
Thank you, Vinod. That's extremely useful. Thank you. We are pretty much towards the end of our session, and I was wondering whether a couple of other questions which would be quite relevant, I think. And one is, of course, and perhaps the TRAI might be the place where we could pose this, is does TRAI have a view on local manufacturing versus domestic manufacturing? In other words, I do appreciate the point you made, sir, that the TRAI is technology neutral, and the TRAI has always supported competition. But given the context and given the kind of discussions that are happening online and offline, it might be useful to get a perspective from the TRAI in particular on this, as to how it sees the larger national good. And also the point that Mr. Dua made about active infrastructure sharing, which will in fact become even more important as we move towards Open RAN, etc. And maybe later on, I can ask Mr. Joseph, in fact, to deal with issues like the issues that Mr. General Kochhar made about our strengths in network software versus other software. And of course, I think you are absolutely right, Ms. Joseph and Mr. Gange, as well as Balaji, that we really have to focus on standards and testing. The testing focus that Mr. Gange brought in is extremely valuable. And maybe, again, it's something that the Secretary TRAI may have some wisdom to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Uppal.
You're welcome.
First of all, thanks to all of them, all the distinguished panelists here. I have noted down their inputs and broad perspective, because how to actually, of course, my answering the questions may not be the only way to go forward.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. We want your comments rather than answers. I understand it's off the cuff and it's certainly something that you would want to do more deliberately. Yeah.
Not only deliberation, I have taken their inputs also, because in my future recommendations, etc., there are certain, whatever they have given inputs, we need to cover all those aspects. Of course, we'll be coming up with future consultations. Now, maybe few points I would like to give my perspective. One is, of course, about the domestic design you are talking about. In fact, our earlier recommendations did cover domestic, especially design and development in India. India, we had definitely strengths, design aspects especially. So we had actually recommended, and then we will continue to pursue with the DOT and other government departments, because we are not only covering at present telecom. So in the convergence in the offing, so we need to worry about the broadcasting sector too. In both the sectors, actually, we are concerned, and then we are very conscious about that. That point is there. And Mr. Gange has actually told that, yes, he has mentioned one thing about whether the testing capability, etc., he was talking about.
Yeah.
But as you are all aware, if I think the test bed around 240-50 crores, if I recall, has been with the Academia of Consortium has been created, and I was actually fortunate to monitor the progress of that. Earlier, 8 IITs and ISCs and CBT, etc., the consortium had developed a test bed, and we need to look at how effectively this can be put to use. He has raised a pertinent point, and then we need to effectively put to use to test this, especially the use cases, whether the ORAN, particularly whatever the development, design and development in India. So that is one point is there already there, and we need to actually bridge the gap of how to use that, and then how. That is one point which he has mentioned, and then semiconductor components, which he has mentioned. So we are conscious about that, and then we will be shortly coming up with another consultation paper on how domestically R&D can be improved, and then as part of the whole ecosystem, I think all of your inputs are sought on that, and definitely we will look into that aspect. So that is about the second aspect, and then another point which some of my colleagues have told about is Mr. Duva's point. I wanted to answer that point. If you see that chronologically, maybe I don't want to take much of the time, maybe just with this perspective. Active sharing has already it has been recommended and it was accepted. That is one point. Another thing is that to make the scope of expansion of IPs to involve them with the active sharing, especially they provide the active sharing too. So that is the main thing which Mr. was concerned, which has not been broadly accepted. So if you recall, even the sharing, he himself has given the answer indirectly that initially the sharing aspect was not agreed, and rather was many skepticism was there how to go about the sharing of the passive infrastructure, and it became a global hallmark. So now in the active infrastructure too, India will, I'm sure that India will show the way once this has been all the operators, because definitely ultimately the cost components which will come into picture, the cost will be the driven factor. And once this Mr. Dua is offering at a lower cost, why not Mr. Balaji take it, or Mr. Gange can take it? So this is basically my question. So this is there. So all other aspects, of course, I will just give my broader perspective is that TRA is going to look at all your inputs in a holistic perspective, and broadly I can say assure you that we will, in our future recommendations, we will factor in all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And I think it's very, very important the point you made towards the end, that eventually it is about costs and revenues, and eventually a lot of the decision to either incorporate domestic equipment, manufacture in India, etc., will depend on the commercials. And we have to align incentives so that these commercials are aligned with, in fact, our national objectives. But maybe we can stop here. But if Mr. Joseph wants to take up this issue about network software, maybe I'll allow you a line there.
Would you repeat the question, Mr. Mahesh, please?
Mr. General Kocher mentioned that the real challenge was that we were very good at other software except network software. Is that something that you would want to comment on?
No, I mean, well, I think any software, I mean, it just has to come from India. And if you look at the way VMware does our business, I mean, we have, our critical development centers back in India there. I agree to an extent, yes, because a lot of these networking vendors, they own the network stack, but that's going to change with O-RAN. And like Manish pointed out, O-RAN changes the game. It creates that layer of abstraction where the impact of networking software gets diminished to a larger extent, and the actual applications that cater to the use cases, they take the center stage, and that becomes more relevant for anything around O-RAN. And I think that's where the Indian market and the Indian brain is definitely going to make the difference. So I view O-RAN as, the O-RAN equals to the Indian market. I mean, that's the way I would look at it.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe I'll allow a last comments from any of you if you feel that you want to add to or emphasize or even disagree with points made by other panelists. Exactly one line each, because our organizers are a strict lot.
Okay.
General Kocher, one line.
Just one liner that we have missed out one important aspect, and that is cybersecurity. We have to look at, because of O-RAN and because of the PLI scheme, cybersecurity takes a center stage. And the manner in which we have to look at cybersecurity is not the traditional manner. We have to grow it organically and grow it like we are growing 5G. So it has to be a stack within the 5G and not as an overlay.
Well said, and important point made. Mr. Dua, I think you were raising your hand. Did you want to make one last point?
Yeah, just 30 seconds. If you look at the changing dynamics of the telecom industry, the infrastructure industry having played a role in 4G, 5G. Now with this disaggregated this one, it offers more opportunity. Like you'll create edge data centers, which is important. Creation going forward to the 5G small cell in-building solution. These are the opportunities which will come. That's what I just want. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Mr. Gange, any last comments?
Yeah, my last comment is only to strengthen the point that Vinod was saying, that the network platform layer of the software, there are many ways of making sure that we can make it easily available for people to build on. Open source is one key such aspect that we need to examine very carefully to see how do we bring in certain capability through the open source ecosystem and make sure that then we get a level playing field for people who are starting late in this journey.
Thank you. Mr. Balaji.
No, I'm overall very positive, given that the ecosystem is coming together in a good way for India from an Open RAN perspective, from 5G perspective, as well as from an overall standardization and innovation point of view. Important thing just to make sure that we still focus on the overall robust health of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that point is something that we need to underline. I agree with you that virtually all these things will happen only when an industry is already healthy and has the right incentives to deploy domestic or locally produced equipment. And of course, the incentives are also there for players who would need to invest. So with that, I would like to thank each one of you. I will dare not summarize your comments because they're valuable in themselves, and the listeners and viewers would have heard them with rapt attention. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you everyone for sharing your detailed inputs around PLI and Open RAN. Now let's move further. Stay tuned.